The announcement was barely 3 paragraphs long, but its meaning was devastating. Without ceremony, explanation, or public debate, Buckingham Palace confirmed that Queen Camilla would no longer control one of the most sensitive duties inside the royal household. A responsibility she had exercised quietly for years had been taken away, after a direct warning from Prince William. And when she read the final sentence, those nearest to her watched the confidence disappear from her face. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla received the sealed notice in her sitting room before noon. She broke the seal, read the page once, then started again as though another reading might soften the blow. It did not. Her final authority over ceremonial seating plans and royal procession order had been removed. The power would now rest with the Lord Chamberlain's office, the palace department organizing royal events, working in consultation with William. The Queen placed the notice beside an untouched cup of tea, but kept her hand on the paper. She understood what had been taken. Seating and procession order were never matters of comfort. At state banquets, diplomatic receptions, commemorations, and palace ceremonies, every chair and step publicly declared rank, succession, influence, and closeness to the crown. For years, she had reviewed those arrangements before they reached Charles, giving her control over how the family appeared before Britain and the world. William had warned the king privately that repeated alterations to royal precedents, the formal order showing who stands before whom, were creating confusion around Catherine's position. The prince had chosen his words carefully, but his message was unmistakable. What looked like household adjustment from outside was beginning to weaken the place of the future queen inside the monarchy. Charles approved the change personally. That detail cut deepest. Camilla could not blame an overreaching courtier, a committee, or a misunderstanding inside palace procedure. The monarch had read the warning, considered the consequences, and signed away her authority with his own hand. She did not shout. She did not summon the king. Instead, she remained seated, while silence hardened around her, realizing that her influence had not merely been questioned, it had been contained. Yet the crisis had not begun with the envelope. Weeks earlier, during a closed rehearsal, one chair had been moved. Catherine had been told to accept the change without protest, and William had decided that silence was no longer loyalty. But to understand why he was prepared to challenge the Queen, the personal stakes facing each member of the family must first be laid bare. This was never simply a dispute about chairs, doorways, or who walked first. For Camilla, ceremonial order represented recognition after decades of judgment. For William, it represented the constitutional future he believed he was sworn to protect. And for Catherine, trapped between loyalty to the king and responsibility to her own position, every altered placement carried a message she was expected to absorb without protest. Behind palace doors, symbolism had become deeply personal. Camilla had spent years fighting to be seen as more than a tolerated presence beside Charles. Her growing role in arranging major royal appearances had become proof that the institution trusted her judgment. Ceremonial order, the formal arrangement deciding where each royal stood, sat, or entered, gave the Queen influence over the public image of the family. Every approved place told her that she belonged at the center of royal life, not at its edge. William saw the same authority differently. As heir to the throne, he believed precedence was the visible language of succession, showing the public who carried responsibility for the monarchy's future. A single unofficial change might appear harmless, but repeated changes could quietly confuse that order. To the prince, silence would allow personal preference to reshape something that should never depend on private affection. Catherine felt the pressure first. While preparing for an upcoming diplomatic reception, she opened her event folder and found a handwritten seating note resting above the official plan. An aide then quietly informed her that her assigned place had changed for the second time that month. She would no longer sit near Charles. Instead, she had been moved farther down the table, away from the central group of foreign dignitaries. The princess did not protest. She removed the note, folded it carefully, and told the aide that she would not create a scene inside the king's household. A diplomatic reception was an official gathering where the monarch welcomed representatives of other nations, meaning every position would be observed and interpreted. Catherine understood the message, yet she feared that challenging it would force Charles to choose between his wife and his son. William entered moments later and noticed the replaced card. He asked Catherine what had changed, then grew still when she explained. The future king argued that patience was becoming dangerous. She urged him not to confront his father in anger, but he warned that continued silence would eventually look like consent. Camilla defended her choices privately as practical attempts to balance family sensitivities and include people important to Charles. She believed flexibility could prevent resentment. Yet one rearrangement soon moved beyond comfort or courtesy. It appeared to place private loyalty above the established royal hierarchy. That line was crossed during one carefully rehearsed palace ceremony, when a single instruction turned years of quiet discomfort into an irreversible confrontation. The moment that triggered the palace decision occurred without cameras, applause, or members of the public. It happened during a closed rehearsal in the staterooms, where every step had been measured and every position marked. Catherine arrived expecting to stand beside William in the place assigned to the Prince and Princess of Wales. Instead, an equerry approached with a revised plan from Camilla's office and pointed her toward a position behind two members of the Queen's extended family. Catherine did not react immediately. The staterooms were the grand palace chambers used for official ceremonies and major royal receptions, and even rehearsals inside them followed strict order. The event ahead was a Commonwealth diplomatic reception, a formal gathering for representatives from nations linked to the crown. Every entrance would carry meaning. Every position would be noticed. Yet the new arrangement placed her behind Camilla's son and sister, despite the original plan keeping her beside William. The equerry explained that the change was temporary and intended to make the procession appear more balanced. He spoke carefully, but he avoided her eyes. No constitutional reason supported the decision. No ceremonial rule demanded it. The instruction had simply arrived from the Queen's office after the official order had already been circulated. Catherine stood on the marked position and listened without interruption. Then she stepped back from the place beside her husband and moved to the new mark. She would not humiliate a staff member who had only delivered the message. Still, the sadness was impossible to hide. The princess knew she was not merely being moved several steps. Her public standing was being treated as something flexible. William entered moments later and stopped when he saw her behind Camilla's relatives. He asked who had authorized the alteration. His voice remained controlled, but the room fell silent when the equerry answered. The prince looked toward Catherine, then at the empty place where she should have been standing. William ordered the rehearsal paused. He requested the original procession document and compared it with the revised version. A procession document was the official plan, showing the order in which royal participants entered and moved through a ceremony. Charles had already reviewed the first version. Camilla's office had issued the second afterward. The future king turned to the Lord Chamberlain and made his position clear. Catherine's rank could not be treated as a favor granted one day and withdrawn the next. The Lord Chamberlain, the senior official overseeing palace ceremonies, understood that the disagreement had moved beyond family discomfort. William gathered both documents and walked toward Charles's study. Behind him, word reached Camilla that her instruction had been challenged and the rehearsal had stopped. When William entered his father's study with the two documents placed side by side, the disagreement could no longer remain hidden behind palace procedure. William did not arrive to plead, and Camilla did not enter expecting to surrender. With Charles seated between them, the future king laid two procession plans across the desk, one approved through official channels, the other altered after the fact. The difference was only a few names and positions, yet the silence inside the room suggested something far greater. Then William looked directly at the Queen and warned that another change of this kind would force a formal response. Charles said nothing at first. The king's study had become a courtroom without witnesses, and no senior aide was present to soften a sentence or reinterpret an accusation. William pushed the original procession order toward his father, then placed the revised version beside it. A procession order was the official plan, deciding the sequence in which members of the royal family entered a formal event. On the first page, Catherine stood beside her husband. On the second, she had been moved behind Camilla's relatives. William pointed to the change and asked why it had bypassed established approval. The prince kept his voice low, but the restraint made every word heavier. Charles had already reviewed the original plan. The second version had been issued afterward, carrying the authority of the Queen's office without returning to him. Camilla answered with controlled anger. She insisted that she had been managing difficult personalities, preventing awkwardness, and protecting the monarch from family tensions that could have erupted during the reception. The Queen argued that her son and sister had been placed where they could enter without confusion. She called the change practical, temporary, and harmless. William rejected that explanation immediately. Catherine's constitutional standing, he said, could not be reduced to a personality problem. Constitutional standing meant the public role and rank attached to her position as the wife of the heir. When the alteration benefited Camilla's own family, the future king warned, it no longer looked like balance. It looked like private loyalty being placed above succession. Charles removed his glasses and set them beside the papers. He understood that silence would no longer keep the peace. Remaining neutral would itself become a decision, and both his wife and son were waiting to see whom that decision protected. William then delivered his warning. Unless ceremonial precedence was returned to an impartial office, he would refuse to participate in any event where Catherine's position had been changed outside approved protocol. Camilla stared at him in disbelief. She accused the prince of turning a private household disagreement into a test of loyalty toward his father. He answered that loyalty could not require him to watch his wife's position being weakened. Charles finally asked them both to leave the documents behind. Camilla rose first, but she noticed something before walking out. The king kept the revised plan nearest to him. Yet the final decision would not be determined by anger alone, because beneath the confrontation lay a hidden structure of authority that even the Queen could not overrule. The most consequential royal decisions are rarely made in the room where the loudest argument occurs. After William and Camilla departed, Charles summoned the officials responsible for protecting the monarchy's ceremonial integrity. What followed was not an emotional debate, but a careful examination of authority, precedent, and risk. By evening, the king understood that Camilla's influence over ceremonial order had become more than a family privilege. It had become a constitutional vulnerability. Charles listened as the Lord Chamberlain laid out the structure of control with painful clarity. The Lord Chamberlain's office was the palace department responsible for organizing state ceremonies, processions, and the formal placement of senior royals. Camilla had gained substantial final review influence because the monarch trusted her judgment and wanted household tensions resolved before they reached his desk. That arrangement had once felt convenient. Now it looked dangerously personal. The king learned that her authority was not protected by law or tradition. It existed because he had delegated it. He had allowed the Queen to review final plans, suggest alterations, and settle disputes. But the power remained his to withdraw. One signature could end it immediately. Charles remained alone after the advisors left. He opened the memorandum again and paused over a warning that unofficial alterations could send damaging public signals about succession. A memorandum was a formal written briefing used to explain a decision and its consequences. The passage made the danger impossible to ignore. Moving Catherine from an approved position could suggest that her future role was negotiable. The monarch felt the cost on both sides. Removing the duty would humiliate his wife and reduce an influence she had treated as proof of acceptance. Refusing to act, however, would tell William that private pressure could reshape Catherine's place whenever family loyalties became inconvenient. The evidence deepened his concern. Officials had documented several recent occasions when approved placements were changed by Camilla's office. After the initial review, staff had received conflicting instructions. Senior royals had questioned which version carried authority. What began as flexibility had created resentment, uncertainty, and a growing fear that ceremonial order no longer rested on neutral judgment. William had not demanded that Camilla lose every role. The prince's warning focused only on final approval authority. She could still advise on hospitality, guest comfort, and family sensitivities, but she could no longer make unilateral changes to rank or procession order. Charles drew the administrative order toward him and signed. His pen hovered above the page before he added the date and closed the file. Camilla did not hear the decision from her husband. A courtier she had once instructed personally carried a sealed envelope toward her rooms. The signature settled the matter on paper, but the first hours afterward revealed how deeply the loss had cut into Camilla's confidence and her place within the household. By sunset, the consequences were already visible. Instructions issued from Camilla's office were returned for fresh authorization. A planned seating revision was canceled before it reached the printers. Staff members who once waited for her final word were redirected elsewhere. None of these changes was dramatic on its own, but together they formed an unmistakable message. The queen remained beside the king, yet one of the palace mechanisms that had reflected her influence no longer answered to her. Palace staff received the written order before the working day ended. Every final decision involving ceremonial seating and procession order would now pass through the Lord Chamberlain and a representative acting for William. The arrangement meant Camilla could still offer suggestions, but she could no longer approve changes herself. What had once been accepted as her judgment would now require permission from offices beyond her control. One reversal made the loss painfully real. A revised state banquet plan requested by Camilla was withdrawn before printing, and the original arrangement was restored. A state banquet was a formal royal dinner held for visiting leaders, where seating reflected rank, diplomacy, and national respect. Catherine would sit beside William as first planned, close to Charles and the principal foreign guests. Camilla summoned her private secretary and asked whether the cancelled revision could still be presented to the king informally. She spoke calmly, almost casually, as though the answer were already understood. The secretary hesitated before explaining that the new order allowed advice but prohibited final intervention outside the approved process. The queen dismissed him with a small movement of her hand. She waited until the door had closed, then removed her reading glasses. Her fingers were no longer steady. The humiliation came not only from losing authority, but from discovering how quickly the household had learned to operate without it. Her anger turned toward William. Camilla believed the future king had used Catherine's position to impose restrictions he had wanted long before the rehearsal. She saw his warning, not as a sudden defense of protocol, but as the final step in a quiet campaign to limit her influence before he inherited greater power. Charles did not come to her rooms. The monarch was preparing for an official audience, a scheduled meeting in which the sovereign received a government or diplomatic representative. His absence had a practical explanation, yet she experienced it as distance. On the day he removed her authority, her husband had left a sealed document to speak in his place. William received confirmation that the original process had been restored, but he showed no triumph. He told Catherine that the outcome should never have required a confrontation, and she understood that the victory had wounded the family it was meant to protect. After midnight, Charles finally approached Camilla's rooms alone. No secretary followed him. No file rested beneath his arm. When the king entered and closed the door behind him, neither title nor protocol could protect them from the personal truth of what had happened. There were no officials present when Charles finally faced Camilla, and there was no administrative language left to hide behind. She asked him only one question, whether he had already decided before William issued his warning. The king did not answer immediately. He crossed the room, sat opposite her, and admitted that he had noticed the growing tension, but had hoped affection could solve what authority had complicated. For Camilla, that confession hurt more than the order itself. Camilla held his gaze and asked whether he still trusted her judgment. The lost duty felt larger than a change in palace procedure. She had spent years proving that she could stand beside Charles without weakening him, and the authority to shape major royal occasions had become evidence that the institution accepted her. Now the queen feared that every doubt once directed at her had quietly returned. Charles answered with painful care. He trusted her as his wife. But trust within a marriage was not the same as authority within the monarchy. The monarch explained that ceremonial precedence, the formal order showing each royal's public rank, could not bend around private loyalties. Once family preferences began altering Catherine's official position, affection and duty had become dangerously blurred. Camilla looked toward the administrative notice resting unopened where she had left it. She admitted that acceptance by the institution had mattered more than she had ever confessed, even to him. Public approval had never come easily. Every responsibility granted to her had felt like proof that she was no longer being endured, but trusted. Charles did not defend himself. He acknowledged that he had allowed her informal influence to grow because it protected him from difficult conversations with William and Catherine. The king had relied on her to manage tensions he did not want brought before him. In doing so, he had placed Camilla in a position where personal judgment carried more weight than it should, and then left her to absorb the consequences. The monarch offered a compromise but not a reversal. She could continue advising on hospitality, guest comfort, and event planning. Hospitality meant the practical work of making official visitors feel welcomed and respected. Yet Charles would not return her power to approve final rank, seating, or procession changes. Camilla remained silent for several seconds. Then she slid the notice across the table toward him. She told the king that she would not challenge the decision publicly, nor allow the disagreement to become another wound the monarchy displayed before the country. Charles reached for her hand. He did not touch her as a sovereign reversing an order, because the order would remain. He held her as a husband who understood that preserving the crown had required hurting the person closest to him. Their private understanding ended the battle within the marriage, but outside the palace gates, the announcement was already becoming a national judgment on power, loyalty, and the future queen. By morning, the private wound had become public spectacle. Broadcasters abandoned softer language and described the decision as the clearest sign yet that William was preparing to protect Catherine's future authority. Newspapers treated the removal as a palace rebuke, while crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace beneath rain-darkened umbrellas. One image came to define the day: a woman holding a photograph of Catherine as the palace flag moved above her in the wind. The media did not present the change as a routine transfer of household responsibility. Commentators called it an unprecedented restriction on Camilla's internal influence, arguing that the queen had lost control over one of the palace's most symbolic powers. Internal influence meant the quiet authority exercised behind closed doors, where decisions could shape royal appearances long before the public saw them. The Morning Chronicle delivered the most brutal front page. Beneath the words, "Her final word removed," the fictional newspaper displayed an empty gilded banquet chair. The image suggested absence, authority, and humiliation without showing a single face. By breakfast, that headline had been repeated across radio broadcasts, online debates, and television panels. A broadcaster standing opposite Buckingham Palace explained the trigger with striking clarity. Catherine had been placed behind Camilla's relatives during a closed Commonwealth reception rehearsal, he told viewers, despite an approved order positioning her beside William. A Commonwealth reception was a formal gathering involving representatives from countries connected through the Voluntary Association of Nations. That detail mattered because the disputed placement would have been witnessed by foreign dignitaries, turning a private preference into a public statement of rank. The crowd at the palace railings grew steadily. Supporters of Catherine arrived carrying flowers, while others accused William of forcing a painful household disagreement into national view. The woman holding the princess's photograph remained near the gates as arguments broke out around her. Some called the prince courageous. Others called him ruthless. A former royal household official then offered the sentence that dominated the afternoon coverage. Speaking during a recorded television interview, he declared, "Ceremony is the monarchy speaking without words," and today the palace corrected its own sentence. His comment transformed the dispute from family drama into a debate about institutional survival. William watched the coverage only briefly. He switched off the television, uneasy that an action intended to stabilize the monarchy had placed new pressure on Charles's marriage. The future king had secured Catherine's position, but the victory carried no relief. Camilla chose a different response. She attended her scheduled engagement, maintained her composure, and followed the newly approved order without requesting a single change. Charles noticed. William noticed too. Her restraint became the proof both men needed, that the family could move forward without turning one decision into permanent warfare. Once the public noise faded, the lasting meaning of the decision could finally be measured not by headlines, but by how each person chose to carry its consequences. In the end, Camilla did not lose her marriage, her title, or her place beside the king. She lost something narrower but deeply symbolic: the ability to shape the visible order of the royal family according to private judgment. William did not emerge as a victorious son who had defeated his stepmother. He emerged as an heir who had drawn a boundary. And Charles, forced to choose, finally separated the demands of love from the responsibilities of the crown. The decision remained permanent. Final authority over ceremonial seating and procession order would stay with the Lord Chamberlain's office, with William consulted whenever an arrangement affected the direct line of succession. The direct line meant the family members closest to inheriting the throne, whose public positions could not be changed according to private preference. That safeguard removed uncertainty and returned one clear standard to every major royal occasion: Camilla retained an important role. She could advise on hospitality, atmosphere, guest comfort, and selected event planning, preserving both her dignity and her place beside Charles. Yet advice was no longer command. The Queen could suggest improvements, but she could not approve a last-minute change to rank, seating, or procession order by herself. The next state banquet delivered the moment no document could provide. Camilla entered according to the approved procession and took her assigned place without hesitation. A state banquet was the monarchy's most formal dinner for a visiting head of state, where every position reflected rank and national respect. As she passed Catherine, the Queen paused and offered a restrained but unmistakable nod. Catherine returned the gesture without triumph. She understood that the correction had protected her standing, but it had also cost the king's wife something deeply personal. The princess did not celebrate that pain. She simply accepted the recognition and moved forward. William watched the exchange and relaxed his posture for the first time since the confrontation began. The prince understood that the boundary had been accepted without another argument. His warning had not divided the family beyond repair. It had forced them to recognize where affection must end and duty must begin. Charles took his place at the center of the banquet and saw his wife, son, and daughter-in-law following one clear order rather than competing versions of it. The monarch finally understood that peace was not created by avoiding difficult decisions. Sometimes peace required making one. Camilla's mistake had never been caring for her family or wishing to influence events. It was allowing private loyalty to enter a system where public rank had to remain impartial. William succeeded because he did not remove her from the monarchy. He stopped any one person, including the Queen, from privately rearranging its future. The palace preserved Camilla's dignity, secured Catherine's standing, and reminded William of the burden awaiting him. The matter ended not with exile or victory, but with a boundary the entire royal family finally understood. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.